This morning, you stood in front of a mirror and made a choice without really thinking about it. Maybe you traced a line of color under your eyes. Maybe you clipped a small stud of metal through your ear or looped a chain around your neck, cold for a second, against your skin. It felt automatic, almost like breathing. A quick glance, a small adjustment, and you were ready to face the day. Somewhere in a drawer, there's a ring you never take off. Somewhere on your skin, maybe, there's ink that's been there for years, telling a story only you fully understand. You do this constantly. So does almost every human being alive. You probably assume this is a modern habit, something fashion magazines and Instagram filters invented once people had the spare time to care about how they looked. It isn't. Humans were doing this 75,000 years before the first city, the first farm, or the first written word ever existed. And the reason had almost nothing to do with looking beautiful. It was one of the earliest tools your species ever built for telling other people who you were, without saying a single word. Sit with that number for a second. 75,000 years. Agriculture is roughly 12,000 years old. Writing is around 5,000. The pyramids are barely 4,500. So what was happening on the southern coast of what's now South Africa tens of thousands of years before any of that? People were already piercing shells, one at a time, and stringing them onto cord. Not for a season. Not as a passing trend. Across countless generations, in a world with no permanent houses, no metal tools, no written record of any kind. Whatever this habit really is, it clearly isn't a side effect of comfort. It showed up while your ancestors were still fighting hard for their next meal, in small bands where one bad hunting season could kill everyone in the group. And it wasn't only your direct ancestors doing it. Around that same broad window of deep time, Neanderthals in Spain were also handling pigment. A 2008 study led by geochronologist Dirk Hoffmann dated red ochre markings in Spanish caves to at least 64,000 years old, tens of thousands of years before modern humans are known to have reached that part of Europe. Two separate branches of the human family tree, continents apart, both reaching for color and putting it somewhere it served no practical purpose. If two different species stumbled onto the same strange habit on their own, that's a strong hint it wasn't a cultural accident. Something about it was doing real work. The site is called Blombos Cave, and archaeologist Christopher Henshilwood has excavated it for more than 30 years. In layers dating back roughly 75,000 years, a period archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age, the long chapter of African prehistory before farming or cities existed. His team uncovered dozens of small marine shells. They came from a tiny sea snail called Nassarius kraussianus, and every single one had a hole punched through the exact same spot. Waves don't do that. Sand doesn't do that. Someone sat down, chose a sharp point, and drilled through shell after shell on purpose. Look closer and it gets stranger. Many of the shells show a distinct kind of wear, a smoothed, polished ring right around the hole, in a pattern that only forms from repeated rubbing against string or skin or other shells. Researcher Daniella Bar-Yosef Mayer specializes in reading exactly this kind of microscopic damage. Her conclusion was simple. These beads weren't sitting in storage. They were worn for a long time, threaded onto some kind of cord against a living body. Now, widen the frame. Similar shell beads, some more than 100,000 years old, have turned up at cave sites called Skul and Kafze in Israel, at Wed Jabana in Algeria, and at Tafaralt in Morocco, where archaeologist Stephen Kuhn helped document dozens more. Francesco De Rico, who has studied beads across many of these sites, kept finding the same underlying pattern no matter where he looked. Different coastlines, thousands of kilometers apart, no contact between the groups making them, and the same idea kept reappearing on its own. Take a small shell, pierce it, wear it close to the body. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's the same impulse behind a specific brand of sneakers or a particular shape of sunglasses today. That craving isn't a modern glitch in your brain. It's an old one, doing exactly what it was built to do. Pause on that for a second because it matters more than it first sounds. When completely separate populations cut off from each other independently invent the same specific solution, a pierced shell worn on a cord, not a painted shell, not a shell left loose in a pouch. That's usually a sign you're looking at something close to a basic need, not a passing fad. Researchers studying this period even use it as one marker of what they call behavioral modernity, the point in prehistory where human minds start showing the same kind of abstract symbolic thinking you rely on today, the ability to make one object stand for something it isn't. A shell isn't food, it isn't a weapon, but wear it, and it becomes an idea about you. There's more sitting in that same cave. In an even older layer, dated to around 100,000 years ago, Henshilwood's team found something that looked at first like ordinary rubbish: 2 large abalone shells, packed with a reddish paste. Under analysis, that paste turned out to be a deliberately mixed compound: ochre, a red or yellow mineral pigment rich in iron oxide, ground down and combined with crushed bone, charcoal, and a binding liquid, using tools set aside specifically for this purpose. In plain terms, someone built a paint-making kit, then stored it for later use, the way you'd keep a toolbox in the garage. And in a slightly younger layer, the same team recovered a piece of ochre engraved with deliberate cross-hatched lines, not a random scratch, but a repeated, intentional pattern, cut into stone for no purpose except to be looked at. Ask yourself why a species barely scraping by would spend precious daylight hours mixing paint it couldn't eat and couldn't fight with. There's really only one honest answer, because whatever this paint went onto, skin, shell, tool, or wall, mattered enough to be worth the time. Somewhere between gathering food to survive tonight and building a paint kit for later, your ancestors quietly decided that how they appeared to others was itself a kind of survival, every bit as real as the food in their hands. One more detail matters here, and it's easy to miss. Some of these shell beads have been found far inland, buried in sites nowhere near any coastline. A shell only comes from the sea. So how did it end up 100 kilometers from the nearest shore? It had to pass from hand to hand, likely between people who had never even met each other, carried along social connections stretching well beyond a single band's home territory. A tiny pierced shell, in other words, could travel further than the person who first drilled it ever would, outliving the hands that made it, the coastline it came from, and quite possibly the person who eventually wore it. Here's the part that should stop you cold. None of this had any survival value at all. A pierced shell doesn't help you spear an antelope. It doesn't help you outrun a predator or hold body heat through a freezing night. In a world where every single hour spent away from gathering food was a real risk, someone still chose to sit still, find a sharp enough stone, and grind a hole through a shell for zero material reward. What could possibly be worth that much wasted time? Only one thing. A signal, a way to tell everyone nearby something about who you were, which group you belonged to, and whether you could be trusted before you'd said a single word. And once you see it that way, that inland shell stops looking like decoration and starts looking like a passport. If a stranger from 100 kilometers away showed up wearing beads from your coastline, threaded the way your people threaded them, you'd know something about him instantly, who his people traded with, who vouched for him, whether he belonged in your camp for the night. Long before spoken language could carry that much detail reliably across strangers, a small shell around the neck could. Which brings you back to that mirror this morning. Think about the last time you got dressed for something that actually mattered. A first date, a job interview, a funeral. You didn't just grab anything. You chose the ring, the watch, the shade of lipstick, the cut of the shirt, because you needed the room to read you correctly before you'd opened your mouth. Look at a wedding ring for a second. Almost every culture on Earth, completely independent of one another, arrived at some version of the same idea. A small object worn permanently on the body, announcing a bond that words alone apparently weren't considered reliable enough to carry. That's not a coincidence born from modern jewelry stores. That's the same 75,000-year-old wiring, dressed in gold instead of shell. The stud in your ear, the ring you never take off, the exact shade of color you reached for without thinking twice. None of it is really about beauty, is it? It's a signal aimed outward, announcing your group, your taste, your story before a single sentence leaves your mouth. Your ancestors at Blombos Cave were doing precisely the same thing with a shell and a length of cord tens of thousands of years before anyone had a mirror to check it in. So the next time you stand in front of that mirror and reach for the thing you always reach for, the color, the metal, the ink under your skin, notice what you're actually holding. It's not a small thing, and it never was. Long before your ancestors had permanent shelter, long before they had crops, herds, or a single written word, they had already decided that being seen correctly was worth real effort and real risk. That decision has outlived empires, outlived entire written languages, and outlived every fashion trend anyone has ever tried to sell you. Not vanity, not fashion, a 75,000-year-old habit of telling the world exactly who you are, worn the same way it has always been worn, close to the skin and impossible to ever fully put down.